Like certain islands around it, the island of Sodor is not immune to having several bad days of weather in a row, and everyone who lives there is quite used to it, but others like Henry the big green engine, who despite what he's been through, still don't like the rain. "Rain's come back," Henry murmured to himself one day in the yard. He was resting in the shed with Edward, Percy and Salty. "I don't like it," he added. "It'll make the rails slippery and we'll get wet sand all over our wheels."
"I know a place where you could go to avoid it," said cheeky Percy. "It's nice and dry. Tunnels always are."
"Don't start," interrupted Henry. "That was years ago. And you, on the other hand, seem to like the water a bit too much, Percy. Should I be more like you, perhaps, and dive right into it? Maybe I'll take a train with me too. Water's nothing to an engine with determination." He was referring, of course, to the time Percy had taken the plunge, and to another time when the small engine had half submerged in flooded countryside, taking some children home from the seaside. Percy humphed at Henry, but said no more. "What are you guys talking about?" asked Stanley the silver engine, who'd been shunting nearby when he'd overheard the whole thing. Unlike the other engines, Stanley had only just been built. He didn't know much about their escapades and was keen to know more.
"Henry's afraid of the rain," said Percy spitefully.
"And Percy's in love with it," Henry retorted.
"That's enough, you two," said Edward. "Let's pack it in, shall we?"
The two engines continued to glare at each other crossly. Stanley was confused. He wanted to ask about what happened, but Percy's crew arrived before he could say anything. "Come on, Percy, your train's ready." Percy built steam up and puffed away singing,
"Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain."
Henry humphed and rolled his eyes. "He never lets me forget," he grumbled. "Forget what?" asked Stanley eagerly. "If you don't mind me asking, of course." Henry considered for a moment. Stanley was a nice little engine, and like most of the engines on the Fat Controller's railway, he liked him. "I suppose it couldn't hurt," he said, and he told Stanley about the time he'd been shut up in a tunnel for refusing to come out lest the rain spoilt his paint. laughed Stanley. "I see where Percy's coming from." "You laugh as much as you want," Henry warned, "but water's nothing to mess about with." "Pooh!" snorted Stanley. "I'm not scared. No engine could be afraid of water. It's just a liquid." He ran off before either Edward or Henry could say any more. The two engines exchanged looks. "I'll talk to him," the blue engine promised. Later he met Stanley at the big station where the silver engine was shunting. "Henry's right, you know," he said. "Water may not seem like much, but it can surprise you, and it can even be dangerous. A small sheet of it could derail an engine. Stanley was unconvinced. "But how?" he asked. "All I see of it is drops. It's not like the harbour where it's all around you. A little water falling from the sky can't hurt anyone." "Perhaps not," admitted Edward. "But when it builds up on the ground, it can be dangerous. If it builds up under your wheels, you could hydroplane." He explained what that was. "Rubbish," said Stanley. "That could never happen to me. I've got a sanding gear." "It's more common than you think," warned Edward. "I'd take care if I were you. I'd hate it if you got hurt. The forecast predicted more rain." He looked up at the sky. "Although you don't really need a forecast," he added in a murmur. Stanley looked at Edward doubtfully. The blue engine was old and wise, but he was describing sounded ridiculous. At that moment the station master came up.
Leave those trucks, please, Stanley, and come to the harbour. We need you to pull the water train. Henry was going to take it, but he's been delayed with the express."
"What about Edward, Gordon, James and Emily?" Stanley asked. "Surely one of them can take it." But the station master shook his head.
"They all have other work to do," he said. "You're the only engine available. Now hop to it."
"Take care, Stanley," called Edward as the silver engine left for the harbour. "And remember what I said." But I'm sorry to say that Stanley didn't. The water train is just as its name implies. Water is poured into a train of tankers lined up at the harbour near the big station. Once the tankers are filled, an engine is coupled to them and takes them to each of the major harbours on the North Western Railway, where they're loaded onto ships and taken to other parts of the world that don't have clean water to use for themselves. Usually Emily, James or Henry did this job, but as they were occupied elsewhere, all responsibility for Day's train fell on Stanley. By the time he arrived, the rain had gotten worse. Workmen ran about trying to cover themselves as much as possible against the oncoming downpour. As Stanley was coupled to the tankers, the cool, wet rain poured down on him, running beneath his boiler and seeping into his crevices. This made most engines feel uncomfortable, but Stanley felt refreshed. "It's a nice change from being hot and dry all the time," he thought. All the same, he was eager to finish the job quickly and get back to his nice warm shed. "We must go slowly, Stanley," said his driver. "These tankers aren't completely full, but they can still become unstable if we move too fast, so we'll only go at 3/4 of our usual speed." Stanley didn't mind this at all. Being a tank engine, he was prone to the same problem himself. He waited until the guard waved his green flag before setting off. The tankers were heavy, but Stanley wasn't worried. He'd laid plenty of sand on the rails, and there would be more laid down by other engines on other parts of the line. "Peep, peep," he whistled. "Come on, come on." The tankers groaned, but he took no notice. The tracks on the island of Sodor aren't always level. There are little bumps here and there, and plenty of spaces for water to collect and form puddles when it rains. Some puddles are small and harmless, but as Edward had warned, bigger puddles can pose a danger to engines and their trains. Half an hour earlier it had been raining just as heavily. Henry had been taking the express down towards the big station. The wind howled and the rain drenched him, making him uncomfortable. Sand on the rails laid down by other engines was now wet and clung to his wheels, making him feel grimy. "Ugh," he groaned. He couldn't wait to get home to get a good rub down in his nice dry shed. Suddenly the wind changed, blowing the rain into his cab. As his crew shivered, Henry became even more uncomfortable. A chill ran through his firebox. "Whoosh!" he hissed. "The rain's sloshing my fire." The fireman tried to shovel coal into the firebox, but it was no good. The coal was soaked by the rain and sizzled feebly, so he shut the firebox doors and consulted with the driver. "We need to keep his fire going," he said. "We can't do it here. The rain's too heavy and the wind's too strong. Henry's losing steam." "I know where we can go," replied the driver. Henry won't like it, but it's close by and it'll be dry enough for us to build up his fire there. He released the brakes and opened the regulator, letting what little steam Henry had left into his cylinders. He was right about Henry not liking it. "Oh no, not here," he complained when he saw the tunnel. "Not again." But neither the weather nor his crew gave him any choice. With nothing else to do, Henry sulked as his crew parked him inside. "We won't be here long, Henry," promised his fireman. "Just keep your fire burning and build up as much steam as you can." Henry humphed but said no more as the rain continued to pour down relentlessly, forming puddles along the line. As his fireman stoked his fire, Henry's guard went to tell the signalman what had happened. It was half an hour later when Henry heard a familiar whistle and saw the light of a headlamp in the distance. "Bother," he thought, "Stanley's come to laugh at me." Sure enough, he did. Stanley emerged from around the bend to the big station. He was travelling down the up line, having been switched onto it. "Well, well, Henry," he chuckled. "Percy was right. You are afraid of water. Come on now. You don't see me hiding from it, do you?" Henry frowned crossly and said nothing. Suddenly, Stanley's eyes went wide as he felt something slippery build up underneath his wheels. "Oh!" he groaned. "I'm slipping! Driver, stop!" The driver considered what to do. He knew never to stop while hydroplaning, but if Stanley didn't slow down, he could derail. So he applied the brakes. Stanley tried to stop as he felt his wheels lock into place, but he couldn't. His brakes were useless against the water surging in the tanks as they pushed him along. The points ahead set to redirect Stanley back onto the downline were covered by a thin film of water. As Stanley's wheels slipped helplessly along, his eyes widened in horror as he felt his wheels leave the rails. "Horrors!" he cried and shut his eyes. Crash! The tankers collided against each other. Holes had broken in some of them and water trickled out from them as they lay derailed. Stanley's driver and fireman had jumped clear, but Stanley lay dazed and surprised. "Well, well, well," chuckled Henry. "I'm surprised at you, Stanley. Fancy you screaming like that. Come on, chap. No engine could be afraid of water. It's just a liquid." Stanley said nothing. He was feeling his position deeply. Mud seeped through the spaces between the spokes of his wheels. Edward arrived with a breakdown train to clear the mess. Stanley gulped when he saw a stout figure in a top hat walk towards him. "My railway is not a water park," said the Fat Controller sternly. "I expect better from you, Stanley. Your carelessness has wasted several galleons of water. Now everyone who needs it will have to wait until our next shipment." "I am sorry, sir," Stanley said. "Edward warned me to be careful, but I didn't listen." "You'd have been wise to do so," replied the Fat Controller. "Edward is a wise and experienced engine. He would never warn you about anything without good cause. You will go back to pushing trucks in the yard," he continued, "and you will not be allowed onto the main line until I can trust you to be more careful in bad weather." "Yes, sir," said Stanley shamefully. After Henry left with his train, Edward and the breakdown gang helped Stanley back onto the line. Then Edward coupled up to Stanley and pulled him back to the big station. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you, Edward," said the tank engine humbly. Now I shall have to stay until the Fat Controller forgives me. I don't think he will," he mumbled sadly. "Here now," soothed Edward. "We live and learn. These things happen. You know better now, don't you?" "Yes," murmured Stanley, but he didn't feel any better. Tell you what, said Edward. I'll tell you how I know so much about hydroplaning. How? Asked Stanley. Because, smiled the Blue Engine, it happened to me. And he winked at Stanley. Stanley soon felt better after that. But word soon spread, and after a long time, Henry and the other engines would tease him about it. Look, there's Stanley, who can't pull a train if it rains, they would say. Stanley can still be a bit cocky, as he's only a young one, but he knows now to take better care with water in future. I think he's learned from his experience, don't you?